In the brutal and often fatal world of Henry VIII's court, Jane Seymour played the game better than almost anyone. She was quiet where her predecessor Anne Boleyn had been loud. She was obedient where Anne had been confrontational. She was gentle, pale, and careful, a woman who had watched two queens before her fall from grace, and had learned exactly what Henry wanted. She gave him that, and more. On the 12th of October, 1537, after years of desperate longing, Henry VIII finally got what he had always wanted, a legitimate male heir. The boy would grow up to be King Edward VI. Jane Seymour had done her duty. She had secured the Tudor dynasty. She had done what Catherine of Aragon could not do, and what Anne Boleyn had been executed for failing to do. In the moments after the birth of her son at Hampton Court Palace, she must have believed she was safe at last. Perhaps now she would get the grand coronation that Henry had quietly kept delaying. She had 12 days left to live. The world Jane was born into. To understand what happened to Jane Seymour, you first have to understand the world she lived in. A world where childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could experience, and where the knowledge to prevent that danger simply did not exist. Childbirth in Tudor England killed women with terrifying regularity, regardless of their social rank. Jane wasn't the first queen to die as a result of childbirth, and she wouldn't be the last. Henry VIII's own mother, Elizabeth of York, had died of puerperal fever in 1503, 10 days after giving birth. Henry had grown up in the shadow of his mother's death in childbed. He knew, perhaps better than most, what could happen. For all women during this time period, regardless of social rank, inadequate hygiene, lack of information, and ignorance of diseases and germs made child delivery a risky experience that many women feared. Nobody in Tudor England understood germ theory. Nobody knew that bacteria existed, let alone that they could infiltrate a woman's body during childbirth and kill her within days. The midwives and physicians who attended Jane Seymour were not ignorant people. They were among the best medical practitioners in the kingdom. But they were working with knowledge that was, in the most critical ways, fatally incomplete. In modern terminology, puerperal fever occurs when bacteria like Streptococcus or Staphylococcus invade and infect the reproductive tract. It was preventable, even then, not through medicine, but through hygiene. Washed hands, clean cloths, simple sanitation. None of which Tudor attendants knew to practice, because nobody yet knew that invisible organisms were the cause of death. This is the world Jane entered her confinement in. And confinement is precisely the right word. Sealed inside, the lying-in chamber. A month before Jane was expected to give birth, she disappeared from public life entirely. This was not unusual. It was the law of royal custom. On 16 September 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, she began her confinement or lying-in, a period of isolation that started shortly before giving birth. The lying-in chamber was, by design, a room cut off from the outside world. Jane's chamber would have been hung with thick fabric and tapestries, with the window covered to let in a small amount of light. Traditionally, only women were allowed inside, but Jane was also attended by Sir William Butts, Henry's most trusted doctor. Picture this room. No natural light. Heavy tapestries on every wall, every window. The air thick and still. Fresh air was considered dangerous. It was thought to carry the miasmas that cause disease. Ironically, this belief meant the very atmosphere designed to protect the queen was likely helping breed the infection that would kill her. For weeks, Jane lived inside this airless, darkened cocoon, attended only by her ladies, her midwives, and a handful of trusted medical men. Being confined for weeks would certainly have made her body sedentary. Being in a dark, airless room would not help either. She could not walk freely. She could not exercise. She could not breathe clean outdoor air. The confinement was meant to protect her. In many ways, it may have done the opposite. 3 days of hell, the labor. Jane's labor began on the afternoon of October 9, 1537. What followed was an ordeal that lasted almost 3 full days and 3 nights. Jane's labor had been difficult, lasting 2 days and 3 nights, probably because the baby was not well positioned. Think about what that means in practice. No anesthesia, no painkillers of any kind, no epidural, no gas, no medicine that could meaningfully blunt the agony of a prolonged and difficult labor in the wrong position. The only tools available were prayer, herbal remedies, and the hands of the midwives. Jane Seymour began to feel the pains of childbirth on October 9, 1537. She was still in labor on all of October 10, and October 11, a day in which the friars, priests, clerks, the mayor, and the aldermen of London all joined in solemn assembly to pray for her. The city of London was praying for her. Across the capital, churches were filled with people on their knees, asking God to deliver the Queen and her child safely. The weight of an entire nation's hopes rested on what was happening in that sealed, tapestry-hung room at Hampton Court. At 2 a.m. on 12 October 1537, after enduring a grueling 2-day labor, Jane Seymour gave birth to Henry VIII's son, the future King Edward VI. The baby was alive. The baby was a boy. When the news spread out from Hampton Court into the streets of London, the celebration was extraordinary. Courtiers, ministers, and servants had been anxiously waiting for news from the Queen's apartments at Hampton Court Palace. After almost 30 years and 3 wives, Henry VIII finally had the son and heir he craved. Bonfires were lit across England. Wine was given out in the streets. Church bells rang from one end of the country to the other. Henry VIII, a man not known for sentiment, was said to be overcome with joy. He called the boy his precious jewel. And Jane? Exhausted beyond description after nearly 3 days of agonizing labor, she was told the child was healthy. A boy. She had done it. By every measure of her world, she had succeeded. A brief moment of joy. For a few days, everything seemed fine. Jane was not expected to attend her son's christening. Royal custom forbade it. As was the custom at the time, Jane Seymour did not attend her son's christening on October 15, but waited in her chambers until the elaborate ceremony was over, when Prince Edward was returned to her. The tiny Prince Edward was christened in a lavish ceremony in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court on 15 October 1537. A huge octagonal platform was built for the font, allowing hundreds of guests a good view of the moment when the baby prince was anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. The christening was held at night, and the long procession was guided by a series of torchbearers. Both of Edward's half-sisters, the 4-year-old Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, and the 21-year-old Princess Mary, the future Mary I, were in attendance. After the ceremony, the infant prince was carried back to his mother's chambers so that she could see him and bless him. By contemporary accounts, Jane was sitting up in bed that night to receive the guests who had attended the christening. She seemed to be recovering well. The labor had been brutal, but she had survived it. Surely the worst was behind her. It was not. The sickness arrives. Not until the afternoon of 16th October, 4 days after Edward was born, did Jane become unwell. What happened next was the beginning of a 12-day descent into something that Tudor medicine had no answer for. For Queen Jane was about to develop a devastating and much-feared illness, childbed fever. The infection leads to women developing a temperature of over 100 degrees in the days after childbirth. It can now be treated with antibiotics, but in the 16th century the first appearance of symptoms was a terrifying prospect. Shortly after Edward's christening on 15th October, fever and delirium set in. The likely cause, according to most modern historians and medical experts, was either a retained placenta that had begun to putrefy and infect her body from within, or bacteria introduced during the long and difficult labor itself by the unwashed hands and instruments of her attendants. Despite the best efforts to save her, it was the lack of sanitation, unwashed hands and cloths that caused the infection. A massive infection resulted and killed her. But in those early days of illness, nobody knew what was happening. They could see the fever. They could see the sweating, the delirium, the rapid deterioration. And they set about treating it in the way that Tudor medicine dictated, which is to say, in ways that almost certainly made everything worse. Given the clumsy state of medical arts in the era, their ministrations may have caused Jane more harm than good, and added to her suffering. She likely would have been bled and given purgatives to try to flush the ill humors from her body, and these probably weakened her further. Bleeding, the practice of cutting a patient to release bad blood, was one of the most common medical treatments of the era. It was based on the theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, and that removing blood would restore that balance. In reality, bleeding a feverish patient who was already fighting a systemic infection was catastrophic. It reduced her blood volume, weakened her immune response, and made her body less able to fight the very bacteria destroying her. Jane's doctors were not cruel men. They were doing everything they knew how to do. They were simply working in a world of medical knowledge that was, in the most important respects, completely wrong. A false hope. The fever reached crisis point on 17th October, and it was hoped that she had beaten it. For a brief, agonizing moment, it seemed like she might survive. A contemporary account noted that on the 17th, Jane had experienced what sounded like a natural improvement. Courtiers breathed again. Henry, who had been watching from the edges of this crisis, allowed himself to hope. There is actually no mention of fever in the historical sources in the traditional sense. When looking at the chronology of events, it looked as if she suffered two distinct illnesses. This observation by historian Alison Weir is fascinating. The picture that emerges is not of a single steady decline, but of a woman who rallied, seemed to improve, and then was struck again, harder. Some historians have suggested the cause of death may have been a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to the lungs, rather than, or in addition to, infection. A retained fragment of placenta may have caused one wave of illness, a blood clot another. In either case, the outcome was the same. Primary source accounts from the days that followed are among the most vivid records of what it actually looked like to watch a queen die in Tudor England. Sir John Russell, writing urgently to Thomas Cromwell on the morning of October 24th, described a situation that was deteriorating by the hour. Henry himself, who had intended to leave Hampton Court and travel to his palace at Esher, stayed behind because the Queen was very sick this night and today. The account given to Cromwell that same morning by the Earl of Rutland and the Bishop of Carlisle is even more chilling in its directness. Jane had been gravely ill through the night. Her confessor had come to her. He was now preparing to minister the sacrament of unction, the last rites, the final prayers for the dying, the final hours. By the night of October 23rd, Jane Seymour was dying. The infection had overwhelmed her body. The fever, the weakness from days of illness and the treatments that had made things worse, the sheer physical devastation of that 3-day labor, all of it had brought her to the edge. By the 22nd, it was obvious she wouldn't recover. She was given last rites, but by this time, she may have been too far gone to hear the prayers that were said for her. The king was informed she was likely to die, though her doctors still retained some hope. Henry VIII was told his wife was going to die. The king who had moved heaven and earth, shattered the Catholic Church, divorced one queen and executed another to produce a male heir. That same king now sat somewhere in Hampton Court while the woman who had finally given him that heir slipped toward death. In the pre-dawn hours of October 24th, 1537, Queen Jane Seymour breathed her last, an end to days of suffering. She was approximately 29 years old. She had been queen for less than a year and a half. She had never been crowned. She had produced the king's only legitimate male heir, and it had cost her everything. The time of death was recorded as around 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the October night was cold and dark. Inside Hampton Court, the ladies who had been praying through the long hours of the night fell silent. The king's grief. Henry VIII's reaction to Jane's death was, by all accounts, one of the most genuine and prolonged displays of grief in his long and turbulent life. After Jane Seymour passed away in the early hours of the 24th of October 1537, it's reported that her grief-stricken husband fled to Westminster to hide himself away from the public eye. Overcome with deep emotional pain, the court was plunged into mourning, with the rooms of Hampton Court draped in sombre, black fabric. Henry wrote to Francis I, King of France, "Divine Providence has mingled my joy with the bitterness of the death of her who brought me to this happiness." He wore black for 3 months. He did not remarry for more than 2 years, an extraordinary delay for a king who had previously moved on with unseemly haste. When he finally died in 1547, 10 years after Jane, Henry VIII chose to be buried beside Jane in St. George's Chapel, the only one of his 6 wives to be given that honor. Whether Henry truly loved Jane more than his other wives is something historians debate. Some argue that his grief was at least partly the grief of a man who had finally gotten what he wanted most, a son, and then lost the woman who gave it to him. Others point to the genuine tenderness evident in contemporary accounts of their relationship. Perhaps both things are true. The feelings of a man as complex and contradictory as Henry VIII rarely have simple explanations. The mourning of Princess Mary. One figure in this story is sometimes overlooked, but her grief was real and documented. Princess Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, who served as chief mourner at Jane's funeral. Throughout her short time as Mary's stepmother, Jane and the young princess were incredibly fond of each other. Bonded by their deep Catholic faith, the two women spent much time together. Jane fought hard to mend the relationship between Mary and her father. Jane had been more than a stepmother to the 21-year-old Mary. She had been an advocate, a defender, a woman who used her influence with Henry to bring Mary back into the fold after years of being effectively cast out of her father's life following the destruction of her mother, Catherine of Aragon. When Jane passed away, Mary would have been absolutely devastated. A friend, confidante, and second mother to her, one cannot imagine the grief Mary felt. Dressed in black, the funerary procession left Hampton Court for Windsor on the 8th of November. 200 men followed Jane's body, which was placed in a horse-drawn hearse. Lady Mary, as chief mourner, rode a horse draped in black velvet and was followed by 29 mourners, one for every year of Jane's life. The funeral of a queen. Jane was given something none of Henry's other queens received: a proper queen's funeral. While Jane was lying in state at the presence chamber at Hampton Court, dressed in gold and wearing jewels and a crown, an altar remained close by, where masses were sung all day and night in Jane's honor and to guide and protect her soul. The coffin was set up in the chapel, surrounded by hundreds of burning candles. Day and night, Jane was attended by her ladies, dressed in simple black mourning robes. They prayed around the clock for Jane's soul, and masses were said by the priests. Jane was buried on 12 November in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Legend holds that her body was interred there, but that her heart was removed and buried separately in the Chapel Royal of Hampton Court Palace, close to the rooms where she had labored, delivered her son, and died. What killed her, and what could have saved her? Historians and medical experts have debated the precise cause of Jane's death for centuries, and the honest answer is that we do not know for certain. According to King Edward's biographer Jennifer Loach, her death may have been due to an infection from a retained placenta. According to Alison Weir, she may have succumbed to puerperal fever following a bacterial infection contracted during the birth. Weir has also speculated, after medical consultation, that the cause of death may have been a pulmonary embolism. What all of these theories share is a common underlying tragedy. Every one of them describes a cause of death that is entirely preventable and treatable today. A retained placenta is removed surgically. Puerperal fever, streptococcal or staphylococcal infection, is treated with antibiotics, often within hours of diagnosis. A pulmonary embolism is managed with blood-thinning medications. Any one of these conditions, occurring in a modern hospital, would very likely not be fatal. The midwives felt they had to bow to male doctors in the birthing room for the first time, and some experts believe that a midwife would have noticed that the afterbirth had not come out, and that she had internal bleeding. There is an irony here that is almost unbearable in retrospect. The experienced female midwives who had spent their careers attending births, who had the practical knowledge of generations of women behind them, were potentially pushed aside or overridden by male physicians who had theoretical training but less hands-on experience of delivery itself. Perhaps they forbade any intervention. If a fragment of placenta was indeed retained after the birth, a skilled midwife might have recognized the problem and attempted manual removal. A dangerous procedure, but one with some chance of success. As it was, the infection set in unchecked. But it is worth being careful here. Even with the best care of the era, even with experienced midwives doing everything they could, Jane might still have died. Either way, she still may have died, and perhaps she was spared further agony. Retained placenta removal in the 16th century, without anesthesia, without antibiotics, and without modern surgical tools, was itself a procedure that could kill. There are no clean answers, only a collection of tragedies layered on top of one another. The cruel irony of her story. Jane Seymour's story is saturated with irony. She had done everything right. She had been quiet and obedient in a court where ambition and outspokenness had gotten 2 queens killed or cast aside. She had been patient, gentle, devoted. She had given Henry the son he wanted so desperately that he had remade the entire religion of England trying to clear the path to get one. She had survived the most dangerous political environment in England, Henry VIII's inner circle, not through cunning or aggression, but through careful, watchful stillness. And then she died from a microscopic organism that nobody in her world knew existed. She had done what neither of her predecessors had managed, and given the king his heir. She was safe. Perhaps now she would get that coronation her husband kept finding excuses not to have. But the coronation never came. The safety was illusory. The microscopic world that nobody could see was more dangerous to her than all the plots and intrigues of Henry's court combined. There is also a deeper cruelty in how the very customs designed to protect her may have contributed to her death. The lying in chamber with its sealed windows and its airless dark was meant to keep danger out. The bleeding and purging prescribed by her physicians were meant to drive out illness. Instead, the sealed room kept fresh air from circulating, and the medical treatments drained her body of the strength it needed to fight back. Jane would remain behind closed doors for 40 days after the birth until she was churched and could return to court life. She never got those 40 days. She never got to be churched. She never got to walk out of that room as a triumphant queen mother, the woman who had saved the Tudor dynasty. She got 12 days, and most of them were spent dying. What her death tells us. The story of Jane Seymour's final days is not only a story about one woman or one queen. It is a story about the universal vulnerability of human beings in a world without the knowledge to protect them. Jane was surrounded by the best resources of her age. She had the most powerful man in England as her husband, who spared no expense in preparing for the birth of his heir. She had royal physicians, skilled midwives, warm rooms, the best food that gold and a king's authority could procure. During the summer, Jane had taken no public engagements and led a relatively quiet life, attended by the royal physicians and the best midwives in the kingdom. None of it was enough, because none of it addressed the actual cause of what was killing her. She died from things that had been killing women in childbed since the beginning of recorded history, and would continue to do so for centuries after her death, until Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s and Louis Pasteur in the 1860s began to crack open the mystery of germ theory and give medicine the tools to finally, belatedly, begin to stop the slaughter. Jane Seymour died not because she was unlucky, though she was, not because she was failed by careless or incompetent people, though the medicine of her era was profoundly limited. She died because she was a woman living in a time when the invisible world of bacteria was completely unknown, and when the very best care available was built on foundations that were, in the most critical ways, entirely wrong. Her son Edward VI, whom she died bringing into the world, would reign for 6 short years before dying himself, probably of tuberculosis, at the age of 15. The Tudor dynasty she gave her life to preserve would end barely a generation later with no direct heirs. All those lives, all that suffering, all that death, and the line still ran out. Married for just under a year and a half, Jane is best known as the mother of Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited son and heir. That is how history remembers her, defined by what she produced, reduced to her function. The quiet, pale, obedient queen, who did her duty and disappeared. But she was also a woman who spent 3 days in agonizing labor, who felt the joy of holding her newborn son, who lay in a dark room for 12 days as an invisible enemy dismantled her body from the inside, and who died in the early hours of an October morning while her husband mourned in another wing of the same palace. She deserves to be remembered as both.